Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for a presentation on creative plant strategies. My name is Anissa Luckman, and I'll be your moderator for tonight. This is the fourth webinar of a 5-part spring webinar series taking place on Tuesday evenings at 7 p.m. in April and May. These webinars are hosted by the Durham Environmental Advisory Committee, otherwise known as DEAC, which is a council-appointed citizen committee of volunteers who are dedicated to promoting community outreach and stewardship through various activities and projects to support environmental awareness and appreciation in the region, including educational opportunities such as these. Tonight's webinar is focused on creative plant strategies and getting more from less space. Before we turn it to our program for tonight, though, just a quick housekeeping note. Please use the chat Q&A function for any questions you have for our presenter, and we'll make sure that those get answered throughout. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for the evening. The popular, prolific, and engaging YouTuber Keith St. Jean from Canadian Permaculture Legacy has transformed his property into a sustainable food oasis. His knack for distilling massive amounts of research into simple and clear concepts ensures that you will learn a lot tonight. Take it away, Keith.
That's funny. Hi, everyone. Welcome. So just some background for today's presentation. It's kind of geared towards new gardeners. It's geared towards people who are just getting started and have maybe done a little research on, how to garden. Maybe they've had some small gardens. And I'm going to try to kind of touch on some permaculture concepts. I'll talk a little bit about what is permaculture, but I really want to work on getting to a culmination at the end of the video, or at the end of, I always say video now, let's have it, at the end of the presentation, where I kind of lay down 4 golden rules so that you can walk away from this presentation with, 4 concrete things that you can work on in your garden to kind of take it up to the next level. So without further ado, I'd just like to take a moment before we begin. I think it's really important to kind of be in the moment. So I just want to ask everyone to kind of look around where they are, recognize, we're not at work, we're in a, free country. We're spending an evening chatting about, talking shop about gardening and plants. That's a pretty luxurious and privileged state that we're in. So just kind of take a moment and recognize that privilege and the moment that we're in. I think it's important in your life to kind of stop and kind of really enjoy where you are. So hopefully the next hour is a thrilling ride, and let's get started. Okay, so this is pretty much how most of us garden. We stick plants in the ground. We, till out some rows. We put plants, we look up a plant spacing guide, and there's pretty much nothing else in between. And if you look out when you're walking on, hikes or trails and you're just out in the world, nature doesn't really do this. This isn't natural. This is a man-made thing, a human-made concept of how we grow our food. And this is kind of what nature does. So let me hit play. So this is how nature gardens. This is a film from Happen Films, which is one of my favorite YouTube channels. I find them very, very inspirational. And you'll notice just the sheer plant density. So there's a bunch of different concepts and human sciences that try to understand why this works so well. Permaculture is kind of one of them. There's tiny gardens, agroforestry, Korean natural farming. There's a whole bunch of regenerative ways where we try to kind of observe nature and learn from her bounty, because there's a stark difference between this and just the sheer bounty of nature, to the point where if humans kind of disappeared off the planet, the world goes back to this sheer crazy abundance. So this is some of the products. When I first got started gardening, a little bit of background on myself. I have kind of only just begun my journey in gardening. I probably spent the first 35 years of my life not having a garden. I was an outdoors person. I liked hiking and camping, but I didn't garden. And when I started and I tasted that first tomato, that like mind-blowing tomato, that's when I kind of started looking up stuff like this. What do I need to put on my plants to make them grow? And the reason why we do this is because we garden in a way that's very different than how nature gardens, especially with annuals, where we clear a spot, we plunk a plant in, and then we hope that that plant, sucks all the nutrients out of the soil. We'll amend it with some nutrients for it to survive its first year. And then when it's done, we cut the plant out and that's it. So we interrupt the entire plant life cycle, especially the end part where the plant is putting its energy back into the roots. And we clear out all the other plants in order to do this. And the thing is when we operate that way and when we understand how plants work, which I'll talk about in a second, we need to put more inputs in because we're removing all the natural inputs that create that fertility and abundance in the soil for us. And we kill all that. And then now the human has to kind of come and replace that effect. So these products on your screen are kind of how humans go about doing that. What does nature need to plant? If this is what we think we need to garden, what does nature need? So nature needs, an old beat up pickup truck abandoned in a field. And then nature says, is that a garden bed? And then, a few years later, you have abundance growing out of, an abandoned truck. So where's the disconnect here? Where's the disconnect between nature will grow a forest out of the back of a pickup truck or, the front of an old car? And we all feel like we have a brown thumb and everything we plant dies and our plants constantly struggle. So when nature does it so easily, where's the disconnect? What's happening here? So we'll talk about how plants work, and most importantly, our fundamental misunderstandings of how plants work, which I would say 99% of the people in the world have this fundamental misunderstanding. So how we think plants work is like this. It's basically you put a plant in the ground and it just gobbles nutrients and minerals out of the ground and it eats, and then it grows something and then it's done. So we think of plants as kind of these net consumers. They extract stuff out of the soil and put that into their bodies. And that couldn't actually be further from the truth. It's kind of rooted in the truth, which is kind of the most dangerous misinformations are rooted in the hint of truth, but it's fundamentally wrong. This is really how plants work. Plants are like a soup kitchen to the soil food web of life. So a lot of people know the photosynthesis, how it kind of works. And, it's sunlight plus carbon dioxide in the air plus water. And we take that and out the other side, we get oxygen. That's how plants let us breathe. And we get carbohydrates. And often we kind of really focus on the, turning carbon dioxide into oxygen side of things, especially in school, high school and grade classrooms and stuff like that, where we get our fundamental knowledge of how plants work. That carbohydrate side is really important because what the plants do is they take those molecules, the carbon dioxide, the water, and they, when it rains also the water, the H2O, it'll scrub nitrogen out of the atmosphere that it's falling down through because the air is mostly nitrogen. And that's why you get this big flush of green grass after a rain, because it's not only that it got watered, it's also getting a flush of nitrogen that then the water droplets hit the ground, splash, and that aeration of the splash will actually release some nitrogen gas, and it'll carry it down into the soil as well. So you get this big flush of nutrients on a rain, and the plants don't suck nutrients out of the ground in order to make these sugars. What they actually do is they'll put these sugars out down through their roots. They'll exude them through the roots, and it's like this sugary cake. They're called plant root exudates, and it's because they're exuding like a sugary cake. And what comes and eats them are the fungi and the bacteria. So the fungi, I always get that wrong, fungi, and the bacteria, they eat this, and the plant's basically just trying to trick them to hanging out around its roots. Because soil is basically just a bunch, the difference between soil and dirt is that dirt is just sand, silt, and clay, which is basically just 3 different sizes of rock. And then soil is that plus living organisms, plus the soil food web of life. So the plant can't actually get the nutrients that it needs out of the sand, silt, and clay. It has no way to do that. It can't drink rocks. So it entices the soil microbiology to live around it. Bacteria and fungi, they secrete acids that break up these mineral nutrient deposits in the soil. They form aggregates, and the nutrients are now what's called chelated. It means that it's now bioavailable for the plant. So if there was calcium inside of a stone, inside of a grain of sand, the plant can't get that. But after a bacteria comes and drops acid on that, consumes that calcium, takes it inside its body, and then pees or poos or dies, now the calcium is in a bioavailable way for the plant to actually grow. So it's this symbiotic relationship with the soil food web of life, and that's how plants actually work. So the soil food web of life, you know nothing, Jon Snow. So these are what I consider the 3 final frontiers. It's like the unexplored part of humanity. Space is the obvious one that we are constantly looking up at the stars, wondering what's out there. The oceans, similarly, are vastly underexplored, and there's so much life in the ocean that we don't even know exists, and we're constantly discovering new things. The third one is the soil beneath our feet. And the soil food web of life is so incredibly complex that, just as an example, there's an estimated 25 million different species of nematode in the soil. And we've only categorized and classified about 2 million of them. And we estimate there's 25 million out there, and we could be way off. It could be way more complex than that. But at the same time, a typical growing practice is to spray nematicide on your soil and plants to basically destroy all nematodes. So we grow in a way that we destroy things that we don't even know what they do, what they are, how important they are in the whole chain of things. And it's this worldwide global experiment of extermination, and it's terrifying. So this is one of the final frontiers, is the soil beneath our feet. And here's an example of the web of life of the soil. So you have sun shining down on plants. The plants put out root exudates, and they attract bacteria. They attract mushrooms, both mycorrhizal fungi and saprophytic. Saprophytic breaks down decaying dead matter, and mycorrhizal form association networks between the roots of plants to strengthen them, to balance nutrient, to transport nutrient, and as well as communication pathways. There was a study from Dr. Paul Stamets where they introduced a bug to pepper plants in isolated pots, and there was no interaction when the pots were close together, and they moved the pots further and further apart, and same thing. But then they put the plants in the soil and they gave them time to create that mycorrhizal association. And they found that even when they spread the plants as far as, I think it was a kilometer, that when one pepper plant got attacked by a pest, the pepper plant a kilometer away was informed of that through the mycorrhizal network of information. And it was secreting a pheromone to attract a predator of that pest. So there's this incredible network of life in the soil that we are just starting to understand. And even lifelong soil microbiologists, like one of my favorites is Dr. Elaine Ingham, who's I have a photo of her later on. She's been very influential to me. I was just binging any podcast that she was on when I was driving to work, just trying to learn as much as I could off her, read her books, different research papers she's in. And one thing I really like about her that I can connect with is that she says the more she learns about the soil food web of life, the more she realizes she doesn't know anything about it. And I really find I can really connect to that. My background is nuclear engineering. And it was the same thing with me, where the more that I would learn about nuclear physics and particle physics, the more that I started to think, it's complete black magic. It's really crazy when you start going down quantum theory and stuff like that. It's so complicated that we're just glimpsing in at the tip of the iceberg, and the soil food web of life is really that undiscovered final frontier. So this is kind of basically, the whole web of life. You have nematodes that eat bacteria, arthropods that eat the nematodes, and birds and larger mammals that then, continue the web of life above the ground. But it all starts below the ground. And here's just another picture. I'll kind of skip over this because it's somewhat the same. And this is in a permaculture book. And it's basically just showing ways to replicate that complexity and diversity in your own gardens, and kind of the functions of different groupings. Like even to this raindrop can fall and go 30 miles per hour, breaking apart and crushing exposed soil. That can, for example, spread fungi and a whole bunch of stuff. Okay, so this is what industrial agriculture looks like. And for the most part, the way that we garden is modeled off of this. Not in the history of humans, but in only very recent history. This is kind of how we have modeled the way that we have our house gardens. If you go back 200-300 years, people gardened very, very differently than they did post-war, when we had all these munitions that we dismantled for fertilizer. And when you had that kind of free fertilizer and you apply it to a field and plants do really well immediately, there's that the trigger that says, hey, this is a good thing, this works. The problem that happens is nature works a lot slower than that. And what we often don't see is the downside of the actions that we take. And so why are we trying to copy this in our home gardens? Industrial agriculture is kind of like one farmer per 10,000 acres. The home gardener is one farmer per backyard. So industrial agriculture does what it does because it needs to. It has to do it that way. You can't have one person running 10,000 acres of food to feed a city and do it in a regenerative permaculture way. There are permaculture farms, but they're more labor intensive than industrial agriculture, because industrial agriculture has to drive these giant machines in order to get the efficiency and the crop yields that it does. But it does that because it has to. We don't have to. So what we need to do is we need to really be cautious of the lessons of industrial agriculture that we bring into our home gardens. For example, tilling. One of my golden rules, now that we understand the importance of the soil food web of life, is like, maybe we don't want to cause a massive apocalypse to the soil food web of life once a season, where it then takes a full season to slowly recover, and then we come back again next year and destroy it again. That's probably not the best thing to do. Maybe it was before we understood how the soil food web of life cycles nutrients and returns that fertility back. But now that we understand a little bit more about how all that works, probably not a practice we want to get into. So your food web of life is precious. So this is Dr. Elaine Ingham. I definitely recommend any of her books that if you want to check those out. She's been on different podcasts. I think she was on John Kemp's podcast. regenerative agriculture. I think she was maybe on Diego Footer's podcast. I could be wrong on that. She was on Matt Power's podcast, YouTube channel. So there's a couple places you can check her out. I would love it if she came on my channel, but I don't think I'm big enough to get someone of her stature. Okay, so these are my golden rules. So this is after, keep in mind that I'm fairly new to gardening. When I get into something, I get really into it. So, my wife and I, we joined a bowling team, and the next day I had my own bowl, my own shoes. I was taking lessons. I was learning about spin mechanics. Like, that's just the kind of person I am. I don't do anything aside to be, the world's best at it. I get into stuff really hard. So when I got into gardening, it wasn't okay to just have a garden. I wanted to learn the best way to garden. I wanted to learn the theory and the reason why things work. And I found in the gardening space, there's a lot of stuff like this, which is just, do these things, but there was never any explanation why. And it wasn't until I got into permaculture and some of the work of these scientists like Dr. Ingham, Dr. Paul Stamets, Dr. John Todd, some of these people who are, career experts in their field, where I started to really understand, okay, this is how plants work. This is why I do these things. So let's go through the golden rules. The first one is never bare soil. So now that we understand how important the soil food of web of life is, we need to provide for it all the things that something living needs to be given. So that's basically like food, water, shelter. So bare soil is, removing all the shelter off of, a bacteria's home. And bacteria are very sensitive. Fungi are very sensitive, and they get hammered by sun UV. The winds come by and they dry out the soil. They wick all the moisture away. And water is the secret to life. It's the source of all life on Earth. We actually owe all life on Earth, to an inch of topsoil and the fact that it rains. I like that saying. So we need to preserve water, and one of the ways that we do that is by mulching. So I like a wood chip mulch. I garden in mostly perennials, fruit trees, bushes, and they want a more fungally dominated soil. I have videos kind of that talk about different mulch types you want to use in different gardens. And it's all about ecological transition. So going from, a desert to a weed pit, to scrubland, to a grassland, to a brushland, to a forest, like an emergent forest to an old growth forest. As you go along that transition, the soil goes from bacterial dominated towards fungal dominated at the forest side. So depending on what the plant is, if it's a green leafy lettuce, you want a bacterial dominated soil, like with lots of compost and lots of animal manure. They're good amendments for a garden with lots of green leafy things. With fungal, like a tree-based bushes, permaculture food forest, you want a fungal dominated soil, so you want to add lots of wood chips, straw, that kind of thing. But no matter what, even if you're shredding tires and putting them on the ground, even if you're covering it in pea gravel, you have to protect the soil some way, in a way that allows water to get down to the soil. Okay, so never bare soil is like the #1 golden rule. So mulch, you can have brown and green mulch. And what that means is I like to use both. So if we're trying to prevent evaporation of water, then the best mulch is both. So brown mulch would be like a layer of wood chips, and green mulch is living plants. So it's not, cutting a bunch of green plants and dropping them down. That's good as a chop and drop. I consider that kind of like a brown mulch, just kind of like a dead mulch. Green mulch, I mean like a living plant mulch. So pretty much all my garden beds, even where I grow my tomatoes, I grow them under or through, a ground cover of plants. And the reason for that is that whole plant root exudate thing. So the more plants I have, the more photosynthesis I have going on, and the more plant root exudates are going down into the soil, the more sugary cakes for bacteria and all the soil food web of life. So any kind of living system will swell or expand based on the food available to it. So the more food you're putting in, the more bacteria you're getting, and all the other food web of life, the more they're breaking apart the nutrients in the sand, silt, and clay, and then the more nutrients are available to the plants. So more plants don't necessarily suck more nutrients out of the ground, and that's the big disconnect. More plants put more food into the ground, and more soil food web of life break more soil up to create more nutrients for the plants. So you have more nutrients available to the plants. And this is why in that, the forest clip that I showed, there's an extreme density there, and everything, you don't see signs of nitrogen deficiency. You don't see a lot of yellowing. You don't see a lot of weird nutrient mineral deficiencies like purple and blue and spotted leaves. Everything's green and healthy. So everything's getting what it needs, and there's tons of plants. That's because there's tons of root exudates going down into the ground. Okay. Number 2, maximize photosynthesis. So that's kind of what I was just talking about. So in your daily life, so if you're thinking, how am I going to take this and use it in my garden? Pretty much just plant more plants, cram more things. I don't care what it is. Put a plant in a bare spot. So that plant's on display look on that first slide with, the lettuce, a foot apart with bare soil all around it. There's almost no food going into the soil food web of life, which then feed your plants. So cram it full. And then those plants actually act as, the green mulch layer as well, where they're shading the soil and they're stopping water from wicking away and evaporating away. The more water you have as well, the more life you have. So this is designing in 3D. So I'll get to some of a couple garden pictures I have from the internet. Some are mine, and I'll talk about that there. But I like a saying, nature abhors a vacuum. That basically means if there's a blank space, nature's going to put something in it. So make sure that you're planting densely so that the plant that goes in that blank space is something you want. It's not something you don't want. Because something you don't want will go in it, and then you have to pull it out, but then there's a blank space, so something will go in it, and you have to pull it out, and there's a blank space. And then you're pulling out all this material, and all this material's, it's plants, and the plants have cell walls, and those cell walls came from somewhere, it came from the soil and came from the air a bit, but, they're pulling the nutrients out. So when you're always weeding, and you're always pulling these plants out of your garden, and you're always systematically extracting nutrients out of your soil, you're just depleting your soils. So what's most important is that anything you take out gets returned back to the soil. So continuous planting, even fall and winter. So a really good practice is once your plants are done, or ideally a little before they're done, start planting what's going there next. So even if it's something that you won't necessarily eat, like if you're going to put in some winter rye or some alfalfa, some cowpea, some vetch, try to get something in the ground always. So when, maybe September or so, August, September starts rolling around, you should be thinking, okay, my tomatoes are almost done, my zucchini's almost done. What am I going to put in there next and sow seed? And then when your plants are finally done and the little baby seeds are coming up, you can now cut the zucchini out, you can compost it. The compost goes back into the garden in the fall or in the spring. And now there's more plants that are growing, and they're going to keep that photosynthesis energy going. Because if you think about it, if you're a bacteria or a soil life, now that you kind of know how plants work, where plants are, your source of plant root exudates, it's your source of food. If you're in this garden and it's got a whole bunch of lettuce or it's got a whole bunch of tomatoes and peppers, and then all of a sudden the human comes in, or the plants just end for the season and nothing else goes in there, you got no food. And when a population has no food, it crashes. So it doesn't only, just go adjust itself to the new lower food, it goes through a crash cycle. So your soil bacteria and your microbiology does this when you don't continuously put plants in. So really look for ways that you can extend your season in time, even if you're just sowing like anything. Sow mullein or something like that. Mullein, like one mullein plant will have 100,000 seeds in one mullein plant. So just spread it everywhere. And a big part of that is also recognizing that there's no such thing as a weed. So a lot of the plants that we consider weeds are fantastic plants. So make sure you're learning about those things that you think are weeds, make sure you learn about what their uses are. And at the very least, any plant is creating photosynthesis. So I'll take any plant, I swear, any plant, poison ivy. I'll take any plant in a spot instead of bare soil, because at least it's putting nutrients into the ground. And again, nature abhors a vacuum, so maybe put what you want there first so that you don't get a poison ivy or a giant hogweed or something like that growing there. Okay, so there's some good cover crops that you can look at. These are especially good for like a winter transition. Just you can go to a farmer supply store, get a bag of that stuff really cheap, just throw it everywhere, and just keep that photosynthesis energy going. Okay, number 3 is avoid disturbance. So this is tilling. I kind of talked about this. We understand how important that soil food web of life is, so don't go just systematically smashing it. Imagine aliens coming down and just lasers destroying our whole entire planet. Our houses, we're all out and we have no shelter or anything, and then we rebuild all the rubble and we make a house, and then next year the same thing. That's basically the soil food web of life for someone in a garden who tills. So don't do that to your soil food web of life. And then feed the soil. This is kind of linked to all of them, but this is plant root exudates, which I talked about, but there's other things like chop and drop, which I really like. I like getting plants that have very deep tap roots, where the roots aren't really competing with other plants, and they're dredging and mining nutrients up from the soil way deep down below. They have some surface level roots as well, but like a plant like comfrey, dandelions, mullein, some of these plants have very deep tap roots, and they can be planted right next to a tree, and they're not eating from the same location in the soil. So the comfrey is, bringing nutrients from 15, 20, even upwards of 100 feet below the ground. There's been some comfrey plants that have been discovered that have 100-foot deep roots. So they're bringing up nutrients that were slowly sinking into the Earth's crust towards, a magma core death eventually. And they're bringing them up and they're putting them in a leaf of a comfrey plant. So then we can come by, we can cut that comfrey plant, and it's a great plant because it responds really well to being cut constantly. So we cut it and we just put it down on the ground. We just drop it all down, and all those nutrients that fed the leaves and made the leaves were coming from way down below. And in this way, we're dredging and cycling nutrients up and building topsoil. So any way you can feed the soil is how you build more topsoil. Chop and drop is a great way. And just remember, if you're weeding, if you're pulling weeds out of your garden, you're doing the opposite of that. You're extracting nutrients from the soil. So if you want, you pull the weeds out, the plants that you don't want, plant something else in there. But even if you didn't, put those weeds on a sidewalk or something like that to let the sun nuke them, make sure they're dead. And maybe discard the roots just in case you're afraid of those re-rooting. But all the leaves and stuff like that, like maybe you don't want dandelions in your garden. They're a fantastic plant. You probably should want dandelions in your garden. But even if you didn't, and you're going to weed and pull it out, at least take those leaves and put them back down on the soil, because at least then those nutrients are going to feed what goes in there next. So we're constantly having to return that surplus. It's a permaculture principle. Return that nutrient back to the soil. Okay, so what does this look like? So we saw the picture of what a normal garden looks like, right? So this is what many gardens out there in the world look like, and this is my gardens. So these are my gardens here. So it's extreme density, it's extreme polyculture, it's extreme diversity, and it does fantastic. The best part about these gardens, when we do it and we use nature mimicry to create these gardens, is that we offset all the nutrient fertility cycling. We offset it to 1 billion free laborers. We offset it to that soil food web of life. We offset any kind of pest control to the team of insects that we're attracting with all the flowers that we plant. So what that means is sometimes I do get pests. I get codling moths eating some of my pears. But I'll tell you one thing, when I first started this, I had a real big codling moth problem, and apparently everyone in my area does. And we have a bunch of apple orchards all around us. A lot of people speculate land and they put apple orchards on it temporarily, but they're really buying the land. They're an apple company, but they're really a real estate reinvestment company. And they have massive problems with codling moth, and they spray and kill it all. But the thing is when you kill all the pests and you kill all the food for the thing that eats that pest, you're kind of sabotaging the predator. You know, if I wanted to, you know, ladybugs eat a lot of pests. I want ladybugs in my garden. I want praying mantis. I want dragonflies. I want bats and birds. I want wasps. Actually, I want predatory wasps. They're fantastic. If I were to sabotage, if I was to sit around with like 100 scientists and think of the best way to sabotage those things, it would be to remove their food source. So when we constantly remove our pests off of our plants, we're sabotaging the predators. And we're saying to nature that I'm the predator and I'm going to take the role of literally 1 million or 1 billion individual organisms. And I'm going to do that now because I'm going to get rid of the food. So what I did is I kind of stopped doing that. And I found that while I do have pests, they tend to attack, you know, the weakest gazelle in the flock. And then all of a sudden you start having predators everywhere, and the predators see food there and they start laying eggs in your soil. And now you have this balanced ecosystem where you're always going to have some pests, but they're going to be manageable and you're going to be able to deal with it. And you're going to get a ton of surplus of food, and it's low maintenance. So that was the main thing I really wanted to talk about is when you plant like this, it's very low maintenance, very, very low maintenance. And it's because, again, we're shading the soil, so we don't have to water as much. We're offsetting all the nutrient cycling back to nature. We're chopping and dropping if we want. We don't have to help return some nutrients. So we're not necessarily constantly doing things. And I always get people asking, you know, what's the ongoing maintenance of this massive food forest? And it's really, I prune some trees, but I don't have to. I chop and drop some stuff, but I don't have to. And I add some wood chips down, mostly because my trees are still fairly young and fairly small. You can kind of see them there in the bottom left. They're fairly small still, but once that leaf drop starts hitting big time, I don't even really need to add any more mulch or, you know, wood chips or anything like that. It really is creating a natural ecosystem, and you offset all that to nature. So here's some more examples of some polycultures that I found on the internet. The one on the left is mine. So this is my garden from, I think, 3 years ago. And this is when I first started kind of learning about polyculture. And then we have like a market garden style polyculture where it's organized. So, you know, I do the whole disorganization thing. I like the chaos. I like that. It's kind of I like that style. But doesn't mean that you can't have an extreme density and extreme polyculture that isn't also organized and beautiful as well, aesthetically pleasing. You know, everyone has different aesthetics they like. Here's another example. These are both not from me, just for the record. But there's like even on the picture on the left, if you look at that, it looks fairly monoculture, but if you start really looking closely, like you can see peas and you can see melons in there, and you can see onions in the back and garlic. You can start to see that there's a lot going on in there. And that's kind of how nature fits together. It's how it fits all the pieces together. And this is basically maximizing solar panels. So, you know, the more green you have, the more energy you have that's being captured. And that just means the more energy that's going down in the soil. And here's on the left is a typical herb garden spiral that someone makes. And this is kind of what year 1 looks like. And year 2, 3, 4 is on the right. So year 1, like on the left, a lot of people will say, oh, that looks so pretty and beautiful and nice. I want it to always be like that. And you can do work to keep it like that, but you're going to be doing work because you're going to be, there's a lot of vacuum in there that nature is going to be abhorring and, you know, disdaining and putting plants in. So it's not until it looks like it does on the right, where you don't even know that there's a herb spiral there, where you're getting the true abundance. And you know, maybe that's not what you like aesthetically, but it is what is optimal. So you can kind of, you don't have to go wild and crazy like that, but you should just still understand that that's optimal. And if you want it more like on the left, you can put a ground cover in there where you have some plants, but then you have a nice ground cover tying it together, shading that soil and making it, again, really low maintenance. That's the key. So here's just like a video from my, this is last year. Then 2 levels of shade onto the soil so that the soil microbiology doesn't get baked. It can grow. It's got lots of water because of the wood chip acting like a water sponge, and it can multiply. So this is just like a small clip. I just wanted to show, that level of diversity, like the level of, a wall of green, like everything tied together and knit together and just keep cramming it in. This is kind of what an ideal garden looks like. Then 2 levels of shade onto the soil so that the soil microbiology doesn't get baked. It can grow. It's got lots of water because of the wood chip acting like a water sponge, and it can multiply. So in that video, I think right after that, I dig some of the strawberry plants out and I actually dig into the soil, and the soil is just incredible. And it's funny, at my property, my main food forest strip is right near the house, because that was the only area that was so overgrown with honeysuckles and just dog strangling vine and grass that my wife said, okay, because I wanted to plant a bunch of trees on our front lawn, and our front lawn was tiny. It was, if you look at my recent videos, it was half the size. I had to clear out into all that. It was all overgrown wild craziness with invasives. So she said, okay, you can plant trees, but you've got to do the work to clear it out first. Don't touch my lawn. So I did that. And it's funny because this whole area, my whole food forest strip, used to be dog strangling vine, some of the worst invasives out there. And it was built on top of the backfill of our house, which is basically gravel, sand, rocks. There's like, it's really terrible soil. So when I dig into, that area especially, I literally, like I built that soil on top of like a parking lot. And I remember, I think it was Jack Spearco or someone like that was talking about that. You can actually build a forest like right on top of a parking lot. You just have to basically start dropping organic matter down, and nature will just take the rest. Like nature will handle the rest. And I think it's really true. I see trees growing out of cracks in cement, and those roots are breaking apart all the soil and rocks. And it's why if humans disappeared, the whole world turns back into a forest eventually. So I'll take any questions now, and I'll just kind of leave this slide up. This is just like the golden rules, and yeah, thanks for watching. We're 43 minutes, so it's not bad. I left. We got about 17 minutes left for questions. Thanks for watching, and thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Keith. That was a fantastic presentation. We'll just give folks a couple moments here to type up their questions. Once again, you can do it in the live Q&A chat box. And we'll just wait a couple minutes here.
They can be on anything, gardening, or if you want to know more about me or whatever, it doesn't matter. Send your questions. I guess while we wait, just interrupt me if we do have any questions. I just kind of talk about some of the stuff I'm doing at my property. So we're on 4 acres, and the back 2 are like a swamp wetland area. And I've been planting for like 5 years straight. And when I bought the place, I kind of wanted like 1,000 acres or something like that. And I kind of realized you don't need a lot of space. So, even a 1/4 acre is tons. If you just look at the one food forest strip, on the bottom left, something like that can be in the backyard against the back part of your fence, and you can get a tremendous amount of food. And one thing I did want to mention too is that this whole food forest thing, people joke about like the $1,000 tomato that they grew because they built a raised bed and then they filled it with nice compost, and then they planted a tomato plant and it struggled and they got 1 tomato out of it. They spent $1,000. So then they say, why do people garden? It's ridiculous. Thing is, when you do it the right way, You don't need to be skilled at it, and it's very cheap. And a food forest isn't something that costs you money. It's an income generator. You know, it saves you money, and you know, the amount of money, the amount of food that I'm already pulling in out of my food forest, it's on the order of $10,000 a year just in food for my family. I give food away to the community. I probably spent somewhere around that in 5 years on trees and all that sort of stuff. Um, and now I've got basically the next, I don't know, 50 years of my life or so, God willing, to you know, to basically get free food out of this stuff. This year I planted, I think, about 15 pears and maybe about 6 or 7 peaches that were all from peach pits from my tree, pears from my tree, and I have, you know, tons of stuff popping up everywhere where I'm thinking, like, did I plant that? Did I, you know, did I put a pear seed there? I save, you know, any fruit that I eat, I save the seeds and I plant. So, you know, at this point forward, I can expand for free just from cuttings and seed saving. So, you know, to get this thing started, the sooner you can get something like this started, it's really nice. The bottom right picture is raspberries and hazelnuts on the left, and there's some cherry trees in there that you can't even see because it's so crazy. You know, that whole area, you can see the amount of raspberries that are there, and I planted, I think, 5 or 6 raspberry plants that I got for $1 each at an end of sale auction. And the hazelnut I got off of an old lady who is on my drive into work, and I just bought some plants off of her. I think it was $1. So, you know, $7, and I was pulling baskets of raspberries out of there last year. And, you know, anyone who knows me, like, locally, you can't come by my house without me throwing plants at you. Like, I've been giving away so many strawberries and raspberry plants. A lady from a couple people actually from my YouTube channel kind of pieced together where I was, and I was close to them. So they emailed me, and they've been over to my property. You know, I give them moving bin full of comfrey and Egyptian walking onions and raspberries and strawberries. And, you know, it's just, I just have so much stuff there that, you know, it's just so prolific. It's like photocopying money. It's crazy.
Keith, I cut you off there because everything you're saying is just so interesting, but we have a bunch of questions.
Oh, good. Okay.
I'll start reading them out to you. So the first one reads from Terry. Keith, my current situation as a renter limits my gardening to containers. However, I'm determined to not waste another year, and I want to learn and apply as many of the permaculture principles as I'm able to with my container setup. Do you have any particular advice for a newbie gardener in an urban setting and how to focus and apply permaculture principles?
Okay, so maybe you can send a return question if you follow up on this. I want to know, is your plan to stay there, or are you going to look to get land down the road? For now, until you answer that, I'll just kind of answer like a typical, I'm in an apartment doing container gardening. Now, container gardening is very hard to create, like that symbiotic web, the ecosystem. You can do polycultures in pots, and I definitely recommend you do that. So, you know, put your tomatoes in a pot, but throw some onions and garlic and marigolds and maybe a ground cover of strawberries in there. So make a little polyculture in your pot, and definitely make sure it's well mulched with the brown mulch, and then also, you know, the green, you know, strawberries and stuff like that. So work on that, but for the most part, you know, container gardening, it's not natural. So the human does have to work at keeping them going. So a lot of people will fail at container gardening, where if they have a plot of land and they just start putting plants in the ground, and the plants get those roots established, and they, you know, you can feel the system tying together and taking off. Like, you can feel like you're not important anymore, and they've got this now. You're not going to get there with container gardening, unfortunately. I just don't think it's possible. But, you know, try to work on the 3 golden rules as much as you can. Get as much solar energy going into the soil in the pot, cover it, protect it, and it'll lower your watering down in the pot too. But just quickly, before we go to the next question on that, the best skills that you can learn if you're in an apartment or a small area, get really good at saving seeds, get really good at starting seeds, and start trying your hand at propagating. So that means in the fall, go around and collect seeds from plants that are just wild around you. Try to start them and get them going. Worst case, you'll just compost them, but maybe you'll be able to establish like a mulberry or something. If you find a wild mulberry tree, you know, take some berries, squish them up, get the seeds out, see if you can start them. When you buy that land, maybe you'll have 10 or 15 small little baby mulberry trees that you can plant. And then also practice taking cuttings. So that's like taking some softwood and hardwood cuttings, just trim a little bit of a branch. Don't be crazy, don't be invasive. But take those cuttings, look up how to do cuttings, like propagation from cuttings. I do have videos on it if you want to watch those. And there's a lot of really good other people who have great videos on YouTube as well, much better than mine probably on that topic. So learn that and start practicing that, because if you can get good at that, you know, if I wish I was better at that, you know, when I started, like I wish I was where I am now with that when I started, because I could have saved myself a lot of money in getting going. And grafting as well. So practice taking some wood, same thing, cuttings off plants, and then just practice grafting them back to the plant that you just cut them off of. So learn how to graft, look up videos on that, and then try them on, you know, plants in the wild and get good at that. Develop those skills while you're in an apartment, because then when you buy land down the road and you want to try to graft something to your apple trees, or you grow apple tree seedlings and then you want to try to graft, you've already got that skill set. You know, that's a very valuable skill set to get. You can learn all that kind of stuff in an apartment. You don't even need a balcony. You can do a lot of that stuff, especially the grafting and hardwood propagation, stuff like that. You don't need sun for that stuff. So you can do that like literally in a basement apartment with no windows. So you can always try to do that. Okay, next question.
Great. Terry has followed up to say that his plan or her plan is to get land down the road, currently looking.
Okay, yeah, so fantastic. So I think really focus on, I do have a land selection guide video. I definitely recommend you watch that. So I believe it's called Land Selection Guide. I think if you Google that with my YouTube channel name, Canadian Permaculture Legacy, you'll probably be able to find it. That has some good ideas of things you should look for when you're buying land. So definitely check that out. And then, yeah, try to work on like the propagating stuff. That's a really good skill set for you to have that you can develop in an apartment.
Thank you. The next question is, what is a nematode?
It's just a little critter in the ground, like an earthworm is a nematode. So there's a lot of different little bugs and creepy crawlies, and some of them are nematodes. That's it.
Thank you. The next question is, my soil is so filled with clay, would you recommend digging it out or just layering on top? And this question is from Colleen.
Colleen, I love this question. Okay, I get this a lot, especially like in the Carolinas. A lot of people in there have like full clay. So the best thing for you to do, my opinion, you can do two things. You can do a deep double till now and add something like, oh, it's slipping my mind now. What's it called? It's not azomite. There's a product you can add to clay to help break it up. It's slipping my mind right now. So you could do that when you till. So I'm against tilling, but I also have another video called like, what are like, I think it's like 7 things that are really bad to do, but you can do once. So tilling is one of those things. You can do a double deep till to break compaction up and then just never till again. So it's the ongoing practice that's bad. So that'll help kind of break it up. And then you can add organic matter to it as you do that. So you can break it up, you can add compost, like literally any organic matter you can get, like old wasted straw from farmers, stuff like that, mix it all in there. However, what I like even better than that, especially if you're not on a time clock to do it quickly, is look and try to see if you can sow daikon radish. So radishes are great because, you know, they have very strong roots. They're very quick growing. A daikon radish is just like this monster radish. So plant that everywhere. Like if I bought clay soil, I would probably buy, you know, $1,000 worth of radish seeds, and I would spread it literally everywhere in my front yard I mean everywhere, literally everywhere. And let them grow. They'll, they'll break the soil up naturally with their roots, and then you leave them in the ground. So you can kind of just mow them or whatever like that. You can eat the tops; they're edible. But you leave the radish in the ground, and then it's going to be food for the worms, and they'll decompose over a year. So I did like an experiment in one of my gardens as well. I couldn't even see them, and I was videotaping exactly where they were. And in the spring, I came back and I know where that radish is, and I could barely just see it. It almost looks like a loofah at the end. It's soft and spongy, but you can barely see that it's there. And it's just been replaced with basically worm castings. So it's a really good way to break compaction up in an easy way and a natural way where you're not destroying the soil, food, web of life. You're actually building it up. So yeah, daikon radish and sow it absolutely everywhere you can.
Thank you so much. The next question is, being a nuclear engineer, did you ever think you would be on YouTube doing gardening videos?
Yeah, if you ask like 10-year-old me if I was a plant geek, I'd look at you like you're nuts. So I used to play World of Warcraft, like I was a big video gamer. I did camp, and I've always done camping and fishing and stuff like that. But yeah, being big into plants, I never thought my life would go this way. But doesn't that tell you kind of how addictive that this can be? And I think really what it is especially when you plant like the way that I do, where you're kind of like you're more like you're creating an ecosystem, and you just happen to be one of the things eating out of it. It's really rewarding. So every day of my life, I'm out there. Like on my breaks at work, I go out there, and a tree doesn't have a new bud without me noticing it. And I'm always seeing rabbits, and we saw owls. We have these coyotes now. Just the amount of life and just the bird activity. The amount of life that's kind of come into my land is floored me. And I think it's that what used to be like a grass lawn, like it used to be my property, but it was my property and it was my grass. And now it's like I'm part of one of the things that lives on my land. But it's just different. So kind of this connection to your land and connection to nature that I think it's addictive. And I think when I question how did I get here, and my wife kind of laughed at me when I said I was going to do well, a lot of people did when I said I was going to make a YouTube channel and film plants. They're like, well, who's going to watch that? No one's going to watch that. So the fact that it did well, I hope that I get across my enthusiasm for how fundamentally life-changing this can be for your life. If someone like me got into it, then yeah, it can really be life-changing. It's the best thing I ever did, for sure. Thanks for that question. It's a great one.
That was a great one. The next one is from Andy. I very much enjoy the channel. Great job putting together informative info. Do you have any suggestions for wet soil guilds?
So like what is that, soil guilds?
Yep, that's right. Wet soil guilds.
Oh, for wet soil guilds. Okay, so definitely elderberries. You want to put elderberries in there. Willow's really good, obviously. Currants can do really well in wet areas. Let's see, what else did I put in there? Some persimmons can like barely wet soil, but not like drenched, drowning wet. Pawpaws do well. Certain type of raspberries can do really well. And there's what's it called? I think it's Midwest Permaculture. If you Google Midwest Permaculture plant guilds, then they'll have a list of wetland plants and stuff that go really well in that. Additionally, if you look at one of my videos called, I think it was called Adding a Herbaceous Layer to My Pond, I have an Excel table that I link in there, and it has a bunch of local native, I don't know if you're local to us here, but it has a bunch of local native wetland plants that are also good. Like stuff like sweet flag can be really good, watercress. Those can be really good. Petunias, they're all really good, like in actual water, like water lotuses as well. They can be really, it just depends on how wet. Is it saturated soil? Is it wet, wet, wet? And my video talks about, I think it's like maybe 30 or 40 plants, and there's a bunch of wetland stuff in there, so you can check that out. It's called the herbaceous layer, I think, adding a herbaceous layer, fleshing out the herbaceous layer to the pond, something like that.
Thank you so much. The next question is from Sarah. How should we handle an invasive like garlic mustard?
Well, okay, so I have a very controversial view on invasives. And I understand that. And there's a lot of people who do have it. So, I'm not the only one. I don't like a lot of stuff that's on invasive lists because they tend, like, we've destroyed our soils on our planet, like mostly in the last 100 years when we clear cut for like industry and farming. And then typically a lot of cities are built up on top of old depleted farm fields. So we're building on top of, the most fertile land, but the most fertile land isn't fertile anymore because we mined it with, industrial farming. So the soils are all depleted. So a lot of invasives are invasive because they're pioneer plants. So when I was talking about that ecological transition from sandy soil to grassland to meadow, to brushland to forest, that's just the way that the world works. And in any given section of that transition, you have plants that have evolved over billions of years to outcompete other plants specifically in that niche. So when we have depleted soils and we have stuff like sea buck, we have a lot of nitrogen fixers that do really well. So if you look at a lot of invasive lists, it's full of nitrogen fixers. Now, the curious thing about nitrogen fixers, for example, is that after they've done their job, they're really bad at dealing with shade. So they're like a scab on a wound, and our planet's like destroyed. So they do their job, they rebuild the soil, and then they kind of seed out. So in that depleted soil phase of the ecological transition, they're tremendously disruptive and invasive, but it's because they're really good at doing their job, which is healing the planet. So when I see stuff like sea buckthorn, for example, on an invasive list, it makes me furious because it's a fantastic plant and it's healing our planet and it's doing well because the soils are depleted. Other things are different because the world is so small nowadays that we have plants coming from all over the world, and there's not, bugs that eat any given plant, for example, like dog strangling vines, a great example of that. Plants like that, the best thing to do is chop and drop. So permaculture is all about turning your problem into a solution. So use that plant. There's no plant, I don't kudzu, there's no plant on the world that can handle systematically being cut. So when a plant's cut, its only way to get more energy is photosynthesis. So it grows a leaf. And if you cut that leaf, it's out of energy. It's got to take energy from somewhere. It's got one place, it's the root. So it'll take energy from the root and build a new leaf. If you cut it again, it'll take energy from the root and build a leaf. If you cut it again, eventually it runs out of energy and it dies. So a plant, any kind of invasive plant like that, the best thing to do is turn that problem plant into a soil building solution and just constantly cut it as often as you can. Cut it ground level. Don't dig it out. If you dig it out, you're severing the roots and you're going to turn one plant into 100. So don't pull it, don't dig it out, just cut it. Cut it ground level over and over and over and over and over again and build soil with it. That's the best thing to do with something like dog strangling vine. Garlic mustard, you can eat it, so eat the weeds is always nice. I did a video on creeping Charlie the other day. It's not the best plant in the world, but my bees were going crazy over it. So there's value in all plants. Every plant's doing photosynthesis, getting those root exudates down in the ground. So value the plant, number one. But then if you do really want to get rid of it, cut it, drop it, and put something in its place it's going to start shading over it and filling that space, because that plant keeps growing there because there's a hole there. So fill that hole and use that plant as a chop and drop soil builder.
Thank you. The next question is, what are the easiest veggies to grow with this method?
I mean, I think it's largely dependent on where you are. I think garlic is dead easy. It's almost impossible to kill garlic. Raspberries, strawberries, they're like weeds for sure. So you can start there. There's really good perennial greens like Good King Henry, sorrel, lamb's quarter, which a lot of people think is a weed. It's probably my favorite green. You can look at learning about quote unquote weeds that have value, like lamb's quarter, like plantain, like purslane. There's a whole bunch of plants that they're weedy because they grow really well. Mint's a great example. Just obviously be careful where you plant stuff. Mint will take over an area, but if you're constantly cutting it down, it's a ground cover. It's at least going to fill those spaces in. So yeah, I would just say you can stick with those to start. That'll get your confidence up. You can plant a couple big trees. A tree that's fairly big. Not the best way to plant a tree. I kind of had a tree planting guide that I did maybe 3 or 4 videos ago, where I really talked about the benefits of bare root plants. But getting a larger tree that typically comes in a pot, they're pretty hardy. So it's putting an apple tree in is probably going to live. It'll probably do really well. So you could always go for the bigger stuff like that. Yeah, and then try those other things I mentioned.
Thank you. The next question is from Colleen. Do you have any favorite food-bearing plants for shade? I have a very forested property and limited sunlight. I'd love more recommendations for shade-loving plants.
So currants. I love currants. They do really well in shade. Like currant jam, they're really healthy too. So I think if they weren't as healthy as they were, I don't know if I'd like them as much as I do, but I love currants. And they do really well in shade. Elderberries can do okay, like on a fringy shade area. Pawpaws can do really well. Hostas can do really well. Most hostas, I think all hostas, just double check, don't quote me on this. Anytime I tell you to eat something, I'm not telling you to eat something. But I think most hostas are edible, so you can always look at growing hostas. They do fantastic in shade. Obviously, they're like the #1 shade plant people typically recommend. For fruiting, for leafy style fruiting things like strawberries, they tend to kind of need sun. They might give you a crop of berries, but they'll be fairly bland. It's the sun on the plant will really sweeten the fruit up. You could try hazelnuts. They do really well in shade. Look into ostrich ferns. So ostrich ferns are fiddleheads. They do fantastic in shade. Like any fern will do really well. But it has to be an ostrich fern. And there's a way to ID it. I think it has a U-shaped cross-section stem instead of a circle. I believe that is, but just double check me on that. It might be the opposite, but I believe it has a U-shaped cross-section, because there's a mimic that sometimes people try to sell you that's it's not poisonous, but you're not going to have a good night if you eat it. But ostrich ferns, so fiddleheads, they're fantastic for shade. And then don't forget the mushrooms. Mushrooms are a fantastic crop in shade. Hope that helped. I know it's tough. Shade's tough.
Thank you. The next question is, what is the climate like where you live?
The climate? What's the climate like?
Yep. What's the climate like where you live?
Okay, so we're in. I'm in Canadian Zone 5, and our zones are typically like 1 warmer than the state. So I would be a USDA Zone 4, but I'm a Canadian Zone 5. But that being said, my very local areas, like my general area zone, I'll just talk in USDA zone, so Zone 4, However, my very local area, we're up on a hill and we get a lot of winds, and we'll get, and we're right in a corridor. I don't want to give away my exact location too much, but we're right in a corridor. We get some really strong, just like 2 kilometer wide winds coming down from the Arctic, and they blow right through us. It's just a really bad location for that. So in the wintertime, like zones are typically all about the coldest minimum temperature on the coldest day in the winter. So even though our general area is like a zone 4 in USDA, we'll get like -40 Celsius nights every year pretty much. So I have to kind of pretend I'm like a zone 2, zone 3, and I can kind of push it with some plants. Like I have pawpaws and peaches and persimmons, and I even have a fig that I believe survived this year. So for me, it's all about creating microclimates to kind of survive that. So blocking winds, using a lot of thermal mass to kind of offset some of those like -30, -40 Celsius nights. So yeah, we get really cold. If you look up the USDA zone map and you look at the coldest winter temperature and you look at -40, that's the zone I am. It may not say it on my Canadian map, but every year we get a -40 day. So, as far as I'm concerned, that's where I am. Cold.
Thanks. The next question is from Don. Can you expand on designing in 3D?
Okay, so pretty much that's the creation of what's called guilds in permaculture. And so a guild is just a collection of plants that work together in harmony. And one thing I really realized doing this is that, when I first started, I kept asking for, like, one of the questions, it was on wetland guild, some examples of wetland guild, but I kept looking for, what's an example of a guild? So I could just copy and paste it and, use it on my property. What I really consider in terms of a guild is just the shape of the plants. So it's really getting that overstory tree, the understory tree, the bush, the herbaceous layer, the ground cover, and the root crops, and then vines growing up it all. So it's kind of that concept. Now you can scale it up or down. So in a food forest, you might have 150-foot tall oak tree is the overstory. A 50-foot apple tree is the understory. Like a 15-foot serviceberry or pawpaw under that and onwards. In a garden bed, like an annual garden bed, you can still use the same concept. So, for example, I didn't have it here actually. I had a unit cell kind of guild that I did maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and it worked really well. And it was basically a zucchini bush in the center, and then on each corner I put a tomato plant and I vined it up a trellis, and then the zucchini kind of fills the center. The tomatoes get up above it. I had beans crawling up as well, and then on the faces of a cube, kind of, I would have pepper plants. And then I sprinkle marigolds, and I did a row of onion and garlic for the bunnies. And then I put kale on the outside so that they eat the kale instead of coming in and eating everything else. So they kind of eat the kale, they'd smell the garlic and onions and dill, and they wouldn't like that. So they would just keep eating the kale, kind of my rabbit fence, and it worked fantastic. So that's kind of like a guild. It's like working in 3D. So, you just think of the shape of the plants. Like a zucchini plant's going to be, that big, and then where can I put, other stuff? Where does it all fit? And you kind of have to understand how big plants get. But it's basically just cramming all the space. And then, like a lot of garden designs, there'll be a 2D map. And, the square foot gardening method, for example, right? In that square foot, you plant this. And the zucchini plant is 4 cells. So you plant a zucchini there, right? It's okay, I guess, but it's 2D. So you're not taking advantage of 3D. So, you might have a zucchini plant in a 4x4 grid on that cell, but the zucchini plant can have a whole bunch of beans around it, and you can grow those up a trellis and you can get vertical with it. And yeah, so it's just all about designing in 3D where you're trying to capture as much sunlight. So if you're a ray of sun that's hitting your garden, you're seeing nothing but green. And every photon is hitting a solar panel. No photon is making its way down into the ground. So that's kind of that's the point there. It's like, look at your garden and you're constantly adjusting. Oh, there's a hole there, plant something there, that kind of thing. So it's just filling the place in as much as you can.
Thank you. The next question is from Jack. I am realizing I have a lot of bittersweet on my land. Any tips? I'd like to use the biomass, but worry it will reroot.
Yeah, so anytime you have something that you're worried about it rerooting, which tends to be like any kind of creeping plant or vining plant, best way is to just cut it ground level, don't disturb the roots, just like always. And then put it on like a driveway or something just for like 4 hours, just let the sun nuke it, and then you should be pretty good. So yeah, you can do that. Trial it out, in an area where you can kind of control it. You can lift it up, 2, 3, 4 days later. If it's rooted, it'll send this long white, starting root down. So just double check that that's not happening. Other thing you can do is, plants won't root through the air. So if you can find a way to kind of get it up a little bit, then, it won't root through there. The only downside to that is that in order to feed the soil microbiology, soil contact is best. But yeah, if you can put it up like if you have like a chicken wire or, like hardware cloth, like a really small mesh 1/4 inch hardware cloth, you can put it on that or something like that for like a day, let the sun just smash it, and then you can put it down on the ground and it should be fine. Oh, one more thing. The other thing you can do is, like, if you run a compost pile, you can put it right in the center of a compost pile. Like if it's really hot, get one of those long meat thermometers, jam in your compost pile. It should be a nice big pile. Just turn it, give it a nice turn, get that oxygen in there, maybe a little bit of water, and then put the nastiest stuff right in the center of that compost pile when it's like 180, Fahrenheit, and it'll nuke it. So that'll be another way you could do it. Third way you could do it is like you could tarp over it. So if you put it down, put like either a black tarp, that'll just be like pure heat, or a clear tarp, and that'll be like a greenhouse effect. It can get like 300 degrees in a very thin layer. So like spread it out, give it a little water soak, because the water beads will kind of like help it store and hold the heat, and then tarp it with a clear tarp. Let it sit like that on a really warm sunny day, and that'll nuke it big time, and then you won't have to worry about it. It's a lot of steps, I know, but it's better to be safe than spreading something around. But just remember, you not cutting it, it's going to spread. So even you cutting it and dropping it down is still better than just letting it go crazy.
Thank you. Next question is from Craig. He says, "Hi Keith, been watching your channel for a while, appreciate your work. Could you please share some advice on good companion plants for an apple or pear tree polyculture?"
Yeah, so I think like this really gets back to, I used to overthink this a lot. So I think it's not, so I don't know if you've seen my video, I think it's called Companion Planting on Steroids. It talks about permaculture guild design. That one, like I really used to overthink this a lot, thinking that there, an apple tree's got, 14 plants or so that are really good with it, and then each one of those might have another subset of 14. And if I can just find the proper, mix where they all work well together, then that'll be fantastic. It doesn't work like that. So what matters more is just how they physically fit together. There's some allelopathies in nature where a plant puts out some chemical thing like juglone, like a heart nuts and walnuts and stuff like that, butternuts. Cedars put out a little bit of a chemical attack on other plants to suppress them, but by far it's not a concern that you should have. And and even with those other things, I think it's kind of blown out of proportion. So, and the bad thing is it gets people afraid of putting plants together because they think they're going to create some anti-symbiotic relationship. And you really won't. So don't worry about that. When you're putting together your guilds, focus just on the size of plants. Find about the average size of, say, a haskap bush, the average size of an apple tree, and put them together. And always understand that no matter how, err on the side of planting them too close, because when plants kind of grow together, the tips of the plants, they kind of sense each other. They know there's something else there, and they adjust. So they adjust. A plant's not going to waste all that energy to grow a branch into another tree. They've already got this figured out. So even if you plant too densely, the plants sort it out. So don't worry about that. But err on the side of planting too densely, and then you can always prune to adjust. If something's not doing well, you can always remove it. You can always put something new in its spot. And I always like to really overplant and then understand that some plants won't some plants will be outcompeted by others, but the ones that survive, I'll have a really strong, robust guild. So if I was to, put an apple tree together and I wanted roughly 20 other plants in that guild, I might plant 60 plants. And then I'll let the plants sort themselves out and see who wants to survive there the best. And that way, when the guild's done doing its own developing, it's a very robust plants filled with the survivors of that giant battle royal that you just kind of put the plants in. So that's kind of how I design guilds, kind of not by designing them by just throwing a bunch of stuff in there, having a general idea of the size of plants in the areas that they should occupy, how I want to walk through my land, where I want to be able to get in to harvest. But other than that, I cram, and I keep planting. And then I let nature kind of sort itself out. Yeah.
Really sounds like survival of the fittest, huh?
Yeah, it's fun. And that's one of the fun things is you kind of go out there and you're watching your system. You're watching that battle going on and you're watching your system evolve and change. So it's one of the fun things. It's kind of like a little Christmas present time capsule, gift to your future self that you do when you do plant densely like that. It's entertaining.
Alrighty. The next question is from Larry. What is next on your agenda? What do you plan on doing with your abundance?
That's a good question. I'm just kind of tunnel visioned into expanding right now. So I have an old man walking trail area that I did where I put I think 1,500 leaf bags down in a lower area, and then spread them out. So I'm kind of gonna hard reset and grow a forest from those leaf bags. That'll kind of need planting in like a year or two. So that's on my short to long term vision. I want to start cutting a few glades out of some of my my cedar forest so I can break up that cedar monoculture a bit. So I want to start cutting some glades out and then create some glade guilds and food forests inside there. I'd like to take my wetland area, kind of work with it in a way where I can plant into it a little bit and still be able to get in there and walk away without disrupting the ecosystem that's there. And then, so that's just my land. So just pretty much continuously just planting stuff. I really do like planting in wild places. It's something that I caution people on, like don't get started on that. And just be very careful what you plant. Look, you have to really know natives and invasives and stuff like that. But I really enjoy driving to work and in January, February, looking for apple trees that have fruit on them still, and saving seed from those and planting those genetics out in the wild to try to kind of rejoin disconnected wildlife corridors to kind of create a corridor between forests again with fruit trees that hold food for the deer, late in the season when they then don't have food and they start, coming into neighborhoods and getting hit by cars and being a menace. So I like doing that kind of stuff. I might do more of that once I've finished planting my land out. I probably plant 200 to 300 trees or so on my property each year, and then probably at least, when you're thinking of seeds, at least 10 to 20 or maybe even 100,000 trees a year, just in wild from seeds that I save. And Like I like that. I really enjoy driving and seeing like a little guild that I planted on the side of a highway somewhere. I like seeing birds sitting on the trees that I know used to be an abandoned Home Depot or gas station, and now it's like a little apple tree. I find that insanely rewarding, like kind of like where I drive my purpose from that stuff. So maybe I shouldn't be saying all that, on a broadcast, but I really enjoy that kind of stuff. It's just be really careful doing that. Like the world doesn't need people spreading invasives around, but the world does need people planting a lot of plants and restoring ecosystems. So it's a bit of a balance there. Yeah, that's my goal, I guess. Continue making YouTube videos and continue planting trees.
The next question is, do you have suggestions for trees and bush cuttings? When do you cut? What to put them in? How to make sure that they survive winter? They're in Quebec, Zone 4.
Okay, so for cuttings, you want to get them when the tree's dormant. So that's really important. So that's sometime in the winter, late fall to early fall to late winter. And you want to basically put it in a cool environment, but like damp soil. So maybe not damp soil, but like somewhat damp. So like you could do it in sand, but it should stay fairly moist. And basically, the plants. So I have a video on hardwood cuttings. I'm doing a terrible. This is where I would cut and I would retake the shot. So you take a little cutting, right, and you're going to have a few buds, say 5 buds on a cutting. You want it about finger width, and you'll bury that usually about 3/4 of the way in some kind of media, some kind of soil, like a sand dirt mix is good. And you'll bury that. You want at least 1 bud above ground and like 2 or 3 below ground. And the idea is that you want to keep that dormant as long as possible. So that means that you want the atmosphere that it's in to be cool. You don't want it getting up to like 70 degrees Fahrenheit or so. So you want it to stay really cool. So that means like a basement, borderline too warm, like a garage, something like that's even better. But then you want the soil to be warm. So it's kind of hard to find that mix. Some people will kind of like put a heater coil in there or put it on a heat mat, like a seed starting heat mat. You want the soil to be warm, but the plant to stay dormant, so the air to be cool. And that'll maximize the amount of time that the plant has to root. And then like you can take the cuttings, you can wrap them in paper towels and put them in the fridge until you get callousing. Some people do that. Fridges are very humid, so you might get mold growing as well. So it's kind of a balance. I find just sticking them in sand works well. As far as what type of plant, you just have to try a bunch of stuff. Some plants like peaches are notoriously terrible at that. I think mulberry is really bad and hard to do. I found currants and elderberries are very, very easy. So you can practice on stuff like that. Blueberries are another good option. You can practice on those. And yeah, so that's pretty much how you do hardwood propagating. I have a video on propagation. If you look at my, I think, recent 10 videos, it's in there somewhere. I did a 2-part series actually on that, so check those out for sure.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Nick. Thanks for the informative talk. Do you have any tips for the beginners starting with a raised bed and a corner on the lawn?
So I think the best way to answer that is just those 4 golden rules. So especially the mulch. So make sure that mulch is nice and thick. If your bed is not made yet, you can do like a wood core bottom. I really like wood core bottoms in a raised bed. You want like any sticks, twigs, logs that you put in there. You want them a good, probably 2 feet from the root zone of what you're planting in there. So depending on the size of your raised beds, you may or may not be able to do that. But the wood core just, it'll tie up nitrogen in the local area to it. So that's why you need a bit of a buffer distance. But the wood core will hold a lot of moisture down the road. So if you haven't built it yet, layer the bottom with wood. I really like doing that. As far as what you fill it with, it doesn't really matter. You can always build soil as you go. It can be really expensive to fill it. You can put aged manure, that's always good. Compost, obviously. Mushroom compost is good, especially if you're doing woody stuff. If you're doing leafy greens, then you want really bacterial heavy stuff like compost and manure. Make sure the manure is well composted, so it's old, it's well aged, which typically means it's sat around for about at least a year. It can be faster if the person turned it often and got air into the pile, but you want about a year. Rabbit manure can go right onto the bed. It doesn't have to be aged. And then as far as what to grow, just grow what you like eating and just learn, just get started. So like, I think that's the biggest thing is a lot of people, they want everything to be perfect. So just get started and get killing plants. You're going to kill plants. So start killing your plants. And sometimes eventually your soil will get better and better and better, especially if you grow the way that those 4 rules that I had. And just remember that as your soil gets better, it'll get to the point where, my soil now, like if I accidentally drop a seed of something, I'm going to get that plant next year. Like I have to be really careful with cherry tomatoes. They're notorious for dropping and splitting. I'll have cherry tomatoes coming up everywhere. When I first started, I struggled to get a single plant growing. So it's really about don't put any limits or don't put any stress on yourself in the first couple of years. Just get busy killing plants, and it'll get better. Your soil will get better, and it'll get easier because you're getting better at it. But mostly because your soil is getting better because you're doing the right stuff. You're building soil, and you're building that soil food web of life. So, yeah, make sure you're getting a nice 3D planting, lots of plants, lots of soil builders. And if you don't really care about growing yet, you really want to focus on building soil, consider sowing a raised bed of alfalfa or something like that for the first year, and just like build a soil cover crop, a soil building bed. And maybe a tomato or 2, but like if it was me and I was starting again fresh from the beginning, I'd probably throw my whole first year away and I would just do a cover crop of like radishes and vetch and cowpea and peas and alfalfa, and I would just let that bed be nuts and crazy. I would chop it and drop it, and I would build soil with it for the first year, and then I'd start working on my garden plans for year 2. So that's what I would do if I started fresh now. But I know that a lot of people, you start a garden, you want to start growing tomatoes and peppers. But don't forget the soil building. It's really important.
Thank you. Next question is from Catherine. What are some of the big ticket items that save you the most money from growing your own free food?
There's some big like cash crops that you can do, like ginger is really expensive. Mushrooms tend to be very expensive. Garlic is very cheap. Like rice and grains, they're really cheap. Potatoes can be really cheap. So typically the most expensive, the place where you spend your money often is on nutrients, and the stuff that's cheap is calories. So I think a really good idea is to buy your calories. Like if you have a limited amount of ability to do something, buy your calories and grow your nutrients. So grow your green leafy vegetables. Make sure you're looking at some of the most nutritious stuff like lamb's quarter, which is a weed, spinaches, kales, stuff like that. So grow those energy, nutrient-rich things, and then maybe buy your potatoes. You can grow some potatoes if you want, but like potatoes are pretty cheap, and potatoes are a lot of tilling, so it's very disruptive. So if you can buy your potato, if you have to buy something, and you only have so much space, focus on growing your greens and your nutrients.
Thank you. The next question is from Sarah. Also, will this kind of system make a wet area's drainage worse?
No, it's much the opposite. So plant roots are like giant water sinking tunnels. Each plant root basically, it's a lot to do with the molecular nature of a water molecule. So water's H2O, like little mini science course. Water's H2O, and the hydrogens, they kind of bend a little bit. So it's not like it's an O and then two H's. It's like an O and then the hydrogens bend. And because it bends, the hydrogens have a little negative zone here on this side of the molecule and a little positive zone on the oxygen side of the molecule. And what that means is water molecules are like these walking magnets, and they connect and attach to stuff. And it's why you get, it's called van der Waals forces. And it's why a lot of really interesting water properties happen. One of the things that is interesting about that is like capillary action. And plant roots will kind of like, anytime there's like a boundary layer, you know, between a plant root and soil, there's like a vacancy, like microscopically. And when water kind of goes in there, it gets sucked and pulled down. So the more plants you have in your soil, the more plant roots you have in the soil, and that water gets like it just gets pulled right down. And it's really easy to see this in nature because, you know, when we have like dust bowl stuff and you know, like a farmer comes and tills, the ground actually gets so dry and hydrophobic that water will actually plate out and won't sink into the ground. Whereas if you have this dense polyculture of plants, you know, it can rain barrels and barrels full of water down, and the water vanishes. And it's because the water is getting pulled down through capillary action down deep into the soils. So plants in every way possible actually improve drainage of soils, especially trees. You know, and especially trees where you planted the seed and that taproot wasn't hitting a bottom of a pot and then circling around. That taproot can go down. You know, like if you plant like a maple tree or an oak tree or something like that, and you look and the tree is this big, the root's that big under the ground, like maybe even that big. It's huge. And that's like after, you know, a couple months. So when those trees can drill those deep tap roots down, they act as just water sinkers, and they sink that water deep into the subsoils. The soil microbiology goes down, chases that water even deeper. You recharge and rebuild your aquifers. And if you have really wet, you know, saturated soil, it takes a certain type of tree that can tolerate that, you know, waterlogged soil because there's no oxygen in there. But once you get stuff established, you'll actually pull that out. You know, so something like a willow, especially, they're notoriously planted on those wet sites because they slurp up oxygen, or they slurp up all the water, and they really, it's not even that they're drinking the water. It's that their plant roots are drilling holes in the ground that the water's falling, and not even falling down, but it's literally being sucked down into the soil. So yeah, plants are fantastic for preventing saturated soaking soils.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Cam. Are there any nurseries you recommend for fruit trees?
Okay, so I always recommend buying local. And it's because, you know, if I go to like something like Stark Brothers, like a big nursery, they have kind of everything. I don't know what, like the varieties that they might sell, they might do well here. They're probably for, you know, the Carolinas and that kind of thing. So I would always buy local. I would always like personally try to go for a permaculture nursery because I don't want my trees to grow in, like, to be fed when they're small, like fertilizer soup, and then they don't develop defined root hairs to feed themselves because they kind of always have been fed, and like capillary action pulls nutrients up into the roots, so they don't have to develop their own roots very well because they're constantly being jammed full of food. So I like my trees to grow almost a little bit stressed while they're young so that they're forced to send out roots. not stressed to the point where they're stunted, but so typically like a permaculture orchard will understand this kind of stuff better than most. I really like Whiffle Tree. It's a local nursery here in, I think it's Niagara area. I like Grimo Nut Nursery. There's Green Barn Nursery in Montreal that's pretty good. They're very pricey, but their trees are fantastic. Richter's Herbs is very good for herbs. That's in Uxbridge. They sell some trees too, but they're mostly like leafy plants, but they're fantastic. They'll have stuff that you won't be able to find elsewhere. And they're, I just got a shipment of them. Actually, I was just planting before I started this. I have to continue planting tomorrow. I just got a shipment of a bunch of stuff from them, and the packaging's fantastic. They do really well for that. What else? Leroux Nursery, Leurault, Leroux in Quebec. That's another really good one. Tree Time is out west. That's a nice one for getting a lot of cheap plants, like especially if it's more of a forest tree, like a serviceberry, but it's also got an edible fruit. You can get stuff like that really cheap. I think I got like 400 serviceberries for $250 a couple years ago. So yeah, I think that's pretty good. That's a decent list, but always try to get local if you can. They'll have the varieties that do really well in your area, which is really important.
The next question is from Diana. I want to transition my garden to a food forest. I bought a peach tree. I have a pear and columnar apple to plant. I work in a small family garden center. What do I do next?
Yeah, just get them in the ground. There's really not a whole lot to it. I have like a sheet mulching guide, so I don't know what they're going into. You said a garden center, I believe. So, you know, if it's grasses, you want to get the soil converted to fungal dominated soil as quickly as you can. So that basically means killing the grass with cardboard, and then you can put compost down as well if you want, and then getting a thick layer of wood chips down. So that'll start building that fungal network that the trees like. And you're trying to accelerate the soil towards that, you know, the ecological transition from weed pit to old forest. You want to go from bacterial dominated to fungal dominated soils because that's what the trees like. So make sure wherever they go, they're deeply mulched with wood chips. But yeah, other than that, it's just get stuff planted. I would say for the trees, put them around 10 to 20 feet apart, depending on how dense you want it to be, and depending on the size of the rootstock. So if it's dwarfing rootstock, you can put them a little closer. You know, I'd put apple trees 5 feet apart. There's a place that puts 3 trees in a hole, and they kind of grow like a bush, like as one tree. It's like a 3-tree bush. It's basically just 3 trees in the same hole. So you can just experiment with stuff. Sounds like you got kind of 3 different trees. I would say go 10 feet apart. Give each tree, you know, 5 bushes, fill in the area between the trees, and then just keep planting. Just keep adding stuff every single year, constantly. And don't overthink it. Yeah, sorry. Don't overthink it. It's easy. So just, yeah, get them in the ground.
Thank you. The next question is, how do you manage herbs like mint since they spread?
I like them. I mean, I love plants that love to grow. So and I have mint in a bunch of places, and it's spreading, but then it hits comfrey and it hits raspberries, and you know, it's mint's not going to outfight a hascat bush, and it's not going to outfight a comfrey plant. So I find that mint spread, like the whole mint spreading everywhere, I think is, you know, from a lot of people who put, you know, they kind of have like, you know, flat open garden. They have some lettuces in there, bunch of low plants, small annuals, and then they plant mint, and then you have this, you know, perennial that develops this really strong root system, and it keeps spreading, and its competition is a bunch of weak little annuals. So I find mint in a food forest isn't the mint that you might think of when you have a tomato garden that has mint at the corner of it, where the mint takes over that tomato patch, or the annual garden bed. Mint in a food forest, it'll find its own little niche, and it'll occupy that niche, but it'll behave itself, and it's got some stiff competition. Comfrey will put up a fight and take down mint anytime. So they run into some of these other plants, and they don't have a chance of. Mint's not going to climb up your apple tree and shade it out. So yeah, I love plants that spread. I do plant some invasives like sea buckthorn and stuff like that. And again, it's stuff that I eat all the berries, so it's not really a risk of that. Birds spreading it, and I'm constantly cutting it because it's a nitrogen fixer. That's what you do with nitrogen fixers, and it'll get shaded out by the fruit trees and just die because it can't handle the shade. So I do plant some stuff that spreads very aggressively, but it behaves itself. It really finds its own spot, and it behaves itself for the most part. And even if it's out of whack a little bit at the beginning, as a place is getting established, as it starts getting shaded out, like I said, it just gets hammered, and nothing's going to outcompete an apple tree or a peach tree. So once those canopies start closing together, if you really plant in the 3D, maximize 3D space, my food forest, like on the bottom left there, it's going to look very different in 10 years. It's going to be a lot of tall trees. The canopies are going to be all closed. It's going to be very shaded. The trees that are down the ground level that are there now aren't going to survive it. And plants that can tolerate the shade will, but for the most part, it's not like you plant a food forest and you have a design and you focus on keeping that there. You plant out a food forest and then you watch it and you let it evolve, and it's going to change drastically, especially as that canopy layer starts closing in. So at the beginning, you'll get plants running and going crazy, filling all those vacancies, right? That nature abhors a vacuum thing. So they'll fill all that space in, but yeah, it'll sort itself out. And once those canopies start closing in, nothing's gonna outbully, a bunch of tall fruit trees, a bunch of tall nut trees, especially. So yeah, I don't worry about it too much. I'm very careful with invasives and stuff like that, but or Jerusalem artichokes or sea buckthorn out in the wild when I do wild plantings. Certainly wouldn't do that. I wouldn't plant it on the edge of an area of a wild area where it could spread out of my land. And I wouldn't plant anything where there's a real risk of birds or chipmunks or something like that carrying away nuts and doing the spreading outside of my control. So I'm wary of that, but plants that are a 9 out of 10 in spreading nature, like raspberries, mint, like those are fantastic plants, and I love them.
Thank you. The next question is from Larry. You mentioned any plant instead of bare soil. However, have you ever planted something and said, oops, that didn't go as planned? What was it and how do you fix it?
Sorry, can you repeat the beginning of that question?
You mentioned any plant instead of bare soil. I think they're referring to your golden rule of having any plant there rather than having bare soil.
I have to think. I don't really think I've ever made I planted something and it got out of control. I might be there with some of the Jerusalem artichokes. So for example, I have a swale in my backyard and I put Jerusalem artichokes in there, and they spread like crazy. But I mow on all sides of it, so I figure that's a good spot for them because I'll always kind of keep any runners down just by mowing. And then in that bed, I planted mulberry and some figs, and I did sweet cicely and a whole bunch of stuff, hazelnuts and filberts. And that bed is now almost a monoculture of Jerusalem artichokes. The other stuff's still in there, but they're being shaded out because the Jerusalem artichoke grow really, really, really quick and tall. So if you're planting a small tree in an environment like that, the Jerusalem artichokes are just going to outcompete it and then kill the tree, and the tree won't be able to get up over them. So I guess that's probably, you know, the only area that I've lost trees in is that area, and it's because, you know, in the middle of the summer you can't even see into that bed because the Jerusalem artichokes are so crazy. So, you know, there's like a tree in there somewhere and it's screaming for light and it can't get any. So probably that, but I've kind of learned where those trees are, and I've cut the Jerusalem artichokes down. I kind of chop and drop them in that area. That would be the only thing. I haven't really planted anything else where I went, oh, I shouldn't have planted that. When I planted my mint, I definitely thought, like, this is potentially a type 1 error I'm doing, and I just did it anyways. I don't know if I'd be as brave as that now, but it worked out. I kind of was playing with fire a bit in the beginning, but yeah, no, I thought of it with the mint and stuff, but everything plays well decently together. I haven't planted anything where I went, oh, that was a terrible mistake and I'm not going to be able to recover from it. No.
Thanks. The next question is, how would you suggest prepping a section of yard that is much more damp?
It's more damp. I guess it depends on damp. Depends on how damp. Like, first thing I would do is get tons of organic matter down on the ground so that I can soak up that moisture. So, you know, if I would normally sheet mulch with, you know, 4 to 6 inches of wood chips, I might put 1.5 foot there. I might go really thick. Then I would just plant water-loving plants. You know, plants that don't mind wet feet. Stuff like elderberries are great. Yeah, the only other thing I would do is I would definitely consider putting in a pond, even if it's a micro pond. So even if it's like a little 2 foot by 2 foot little mini pond, I would do that because kind of what pond, like when you dig in the ground, there's this, you know, low resistance area where the water from the surrounding lands comes out of the soil and comes into the pond. So when you dig a pond out, it tends to drop the water level down in the surrounding lands around it, especially if that pond can kind of then go out. So, you know, wherever the low point of that pond is, you can control the height of that pond, and that basically controls the water table of the whole land. You have to be really careful with that because you're like, when you're messing with the water table, you might want to give your local conservation authority a call, because you might be, you know, like that's where we get really, really disruptive to local ecosystems. So I would want to know all the plants that are in that area, make sure that there's none like endangered or, you know, plants that I would be dropping the water table on and then causing them to have problems. So I would call my local conservation authority before I did something like that. But yeah, I would think about putting a pond in, lots of mulch, just soak stuff up. And then again, like I said, just lots of plants, because you get those roots going, especially deep tap roots. They'll start getting that water pushed down further and further into the ground, because the water might be pooling there because there's like a compacted layer a little bit down, like maybe 3 feet underground. There's a compaction layer down there from when, you know, maybe they dug the house out or something. You know, driving skids over, you know, who knows. Even like old farmers, when they were plowing the field, when you plow a field, you loosen the soil, but you compact right below it. So because most of the neighborhoods are built on old farmlands, typically there's like compaction layers just below, you know, a couple feet below the surface. So the plant roots will help drill through that. Once you crack through that, then the water can start getting further, and maybe you'll get better drainage there as well. So yeah, lots of plants, lots of mulch, and consider a small little micro pond or something.
Great, thank you. The next question is, I'm really interested in augmenting polycultures with mycelium that produce gourmet and medicinal mushrooms from your video on wine cap stropharia. I feel like I'm going to butcher everything in this sentence because there's a lot of technical plant terms here that I'm not familiar with, but
So
the
far,
question is, have you explored any specific mycorrhizal relationships with trees like chanterelles, hedgehogs, morels, etc.?
to be honest, I'm still learning all this stuff. So like, I definitely don't want to come across as an expert. Like, remember, I only started this stuff like 4 years ago, 5 years ago. I have a lot to learn, and it's kind of one of those areas where the more that I learn, the more that I know I don't know. So I do try to inform people in my videos, but I don't want to come across like I'm some expert for sure. And I'm getting better every year. I'm constantly learning new stuff, every day. It's kind of like a way that I live my life, because I always want to learn something new. But specific interactions with mycorrhizal associations of different mushrooms with different plants, I'm just not there yet. I'd be interested in any reading you have towards it, but yeah, like any specific interactions that I could chase down. To be honest, there's not a whole lot of value to me learning that, because my land is pretty much planted out now. Like, I've got the small little walking trail area. I might do some glades in the future, but my family has been pretty clear that we all think that I have enough trees now. So I don't know if I'd be able to make too many adjustments. Even if I did learn new knowledge, I would just kind of want to learn it for knowledge's sake. But I don't have any recommendations to that level of detail. I think there's very few people that do actually. You kind of have to go talk to, like, someone like Paul Stamets or something like that. That man's a genius. Check out his stuff if you don't yet. I mean, I'm sure you do, just from the knowledge in that question, the evident knowledge that you have, just based on that question. But yeah, Paul Stamets is a fantastic resource for anything mushroom related.
Alrighty, it looks like that was the last question. I'll give folks a couple minutes if they want to ask any final questions before we adjourn for the evening. There are a number of folks in the comments here that have thanked you, Keith, and are huge fans of yours, it looks like.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. I appreciate, people from non-local to us, like from around the world, maybe coming and checking this out. I think that's pretty fantastic. And make sure you check out, future talks. There's going to be another talk next week. So, you don't just have to come watch me talk because you watch my YouTube channel. There's going to be a fantastic one next week that I'm definitely signed up for and looking to go watch. Last week's was backyard chickens, which was fantastic. And yeah, check out, definitely make sure you look for future webinars. So hopefully you guys, the DEAC keeps running these. I think they were very interesting. Very good.
Absolutely. Yep, you're right. We do have one next week. I believe it's off a book by Benita Ford, so that's going to be a really exciting talk. I don't see any further questions come in tonight, so with that, Keith, I'd like to thank you very much for your time. You did a fantastic job presenting today and answering a number of questions. There was a very engaged discussion. So definitely happy to see that.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. I'm honored that you guys chose me to be your guest speaker.
Oh, there's one last question that came in. When are you adding the animal layer to your food forest?
Oh man, okay. I can't get into some of this stuff on the YouTube channel. I have to be careful what I say, because this was like a raw topic at my household, because I've wanted chickens for 4 years now. And yeah, I mean, there's nothing I don't want to villainize anyone, because like, I have a fantastic family. Like, I'm clearly talking about my wife. she does not want chickens. So my sister-in-law has chickens. I'm hoping that she'll see that they're fairly easy, that they are not smelly, and that you're not tied to your property. So those are her big concerns. You know, I have to give her credit. Like I'm a lot. I'm a lot to deal with, especially when you have like shared land and you have this nut planting thousands of trees on your grass lawn. She's been extremely like sympathetic and encouraging to a point. You know, I keep spending money on trees and she keeps saying, how many do we need? Yeah, so the animal layer is something that I want so badly. I want goats to eat my poison ivy. I want hogs to clear some of the new areas that I'd like to plant, you know, run hogs just for a season or even a month or a week, let that, you know, turn that area into Mars and then replant it. I want chickens so badly. I want a rabbit tractor. I have lots of rabbits, like wild rabbits. We also have 4 dogs, and I don't know how the dogs would be with the chickens. I don't know where we would put the chickens. Like I would like to tractor them, obviously. That's a big permaculture thing. So I'd like to tractor them. But you know, a chicken tractor is really good for establishing an area. I have established areas now. It's less good for ongoing. I mean, it's still very good for ongoing maintenance, but it's really good for establishing an area. So I'd like to tractor them through my swales, for example. It's a great place for chickens because their manure goes in the swales, and then every rain event turns into a fertigation event. I think that would just take it to the next level, and I want it really bad. So the short answer is I may never have the animal layer besides the dogs and the rabbits that are native to my property. And yeah, that's just kind of a compromise with me being allowed to be a nut, putting in as much as I put in, and you know, being respectful and thankful for the leash that I've been given. And hopefully over time, like maybe we can start small with rabbits and then work our way up to chickens, you know, and then eventually full-blown hogs and everything like that, goats and everything. Something I want. Thanks.
All right. The question was, what about rabbits? But I think you've addressed that in your answer. So thank you very much. Keith, this was a fantastic discussion. We had a great amount of dialogue here, so happy to see that. Once again, thank you. And don't forget to check out next week's webinar, everybody. It will be on a book on how to deal with self-care and mental health during times of climate crisis. So that should be super, super exciting.
All right, great, thanks. Thanks everyone for showing up. Make sure you check me out on YouTube at Canadian Permaculture Legacy. If you're not subscribed, then it might be awesome to subscribe as well. Thanks, and thanks for hosting me.
All right, thank you everyone. Have a good evening.